other than you come to some unanimous solution, which seems to be...
If you want to put into place new policies or new agreements, like for example reforming the system of Dublin, you need unanimity, and so you can't do anything against, and these countries you can't force them. But what you can, of course, the whole way of bargaining also within the European Union, which you know, makes, you can try and convince or find a deal, let's say. For the moment they haven't found a deal. But there is a possibility for the European Union to sanction states when they are not respecting the basic values of the European Union, which has been used against Poland, which is the Article 8, when they, for example, reform their constitutions and they have elements which are not going against the principle of human rights, democracy and the rule of law. So there is a possibility of sanctioning a state in that sense, but not if the law has not been adopted. Once a law is in place, you can also go, of course, before the Court of Justice. But the problem with the Dublin regulation is that we need a new one, and in order to, if it's not yet there, you have no possibility to actually force them. That's the whole, it shows the whole complexity and sometimes inefficiency of the European governance system.
I just had a question, like you mentioned previously, when certain nations institute border control again. What sort of is like the day-to-day response? Because I can like imagine like a whole like generation of like Europeans, like younger people, who that's what their entire life has been like, where you can traverse the entire continent generally without any restriction. Like, is generally a response where like we do not like this, like basically no matter what is going on, or are they like, is it a bit more acceptable? Oh, this is a heightened period and this is a temporary solution, or like I'm just curious, like on the day-to-day.
That's a very good question. In the border regions, usually people move a lot between two countries. I do, for example. Of course, everybody is annoyed when you have the border controls because you're yourself frustrated because you can no longer cross the border. I remember actually when the Schengen agreement was suspended by France, I remember coming in at Ensheim Airport when Macron, the new president, he was advocating himself as being very European, was just elected, and I came in from Belgium, and now you have border controls, which is not compatible with Schengen, and there was a big line, and we couldn't get in. There was no. It was all because the whole equipment is not in place. So, and I remember somebody from the line was a young man. He said, "Et pourtant Macron a gagné." He shouted this all over the place. So in fact, it showed. I think this reflects very well that the young people believe in this mobility aspect, and if they are themselves concerned by not being able to move, then they get very quickly annoyed. But you do also have people who agree with these measures because they feel, and this is the problem with the border, is that some people feel more secure with the presence of border controls. They believe that this way, you know, they are protected from an inflow of dangerous people. So you have, I think you have both reactions. What we would need in order to assess this a little bit more is some research from either sociologists or political scientists who would do some question of the people, what they think, how they. I don't think that has been done so far.
Well, now, so they just hop on, like, I wonder, and we probably don't know this, like, just what the effects on, like, commerce is, right? Like, I'm sure there'd be some way, like, if for a week you'd be able to measure, like, the international, like, in between nations, like, how it affects, like, their, like, just the GDP, right? For a complete month, border controls are in, how much productivity is affected, right? Like, if it's...
That has already been demonstrated.
Okay.
It has demonstrated that there is a true cost, immediate, when you put into place these border controls on commerce. It's an enormous cost. It impedes the free circulation. So that has already been shown. I've seen 2 or 3 presentations on that subject. They could actually present figures on how much loss you got because of.
And ironically enough, I think too, it costs money to implement border control, right? So it's costing you money to implement these, and then it's costing you money on the other hand to.
When you lose of course.
Do you think the lack of solidarity or the inability for member states to harmonize their policies, I guess, more uniformly, would contribute towards these sort of border policies or for
You mean the lack of solidarity has resulted in these? Yes, I think that's one of the. I personally believe that if you try, if you want to resolve this solution, you would have to make out of migration policies a common European policy. That would really solve the problem. But it's impossible. It's like the common agricultural policy in the 1960s. But at the moment, this is impossible to put into place. But this would really solve the problem because migrants, asylum seekers, would be dealt with the same, and so this would already change also their behavior, and it would also, it would kind of make it a common issue, and it would solve all the problems. Yeah.
And at the same time, it might be very difficult to uniformly, because it's impossible to uniformly harmonize something 100%. So it would be difficult.
Yeah, you might not have to do it 100%. I mean, but you can. A common policy means not necessarily 100% harmonization. You still have 100 different cheeses in France and beers, and so if we're thinking of the agricultural policy, so you can have diversity, but the point is that once you make it a common policy, you make the decision process common, and so you don't have the problem of unanimity any longer, and you can overrule the refusal countries in these questions, and that is I think that's the main end. You can adopt further community law on the subject, on, to harmonize some things and not others. So you can do that slowly but surely if you decide you want to have a common migration policy. But as I said, I think this is utopia at the moment. It's not what happened.
Yeah, I'm certainly not an expert in this area, but it strikes me listening to your presentation, just sort of based on what I've heard in the news over the years, is that there's a real, so you've got this crisis that occurs, no one was anticipating it. I suppose the climate change, people would say we should have anticipated it years in advance, decades in advance. But it seems, it's sort of picking up on your last couple of responses, that there's a mismatch between the tools that are available. So I kept on thinking about Greece. So it's not meeting its debt targets, and really the best way for it to do it would be to have its own currency. It would be the simplest thing, but it's not part of the way that the EU wants to do things. So it does have this 100%, in many areas, 100% solution, and so then there are things here about, well, who gets funded for what, and where, and what kind of migrants do you have in the chain of coming and moving through all of Europe, and are there tools and administrative practices to put the right kind of money in different places? And so it seems like a lot of this, in some cases, it could be about national identity. It could be about all of a sudden having 500,000 people on your border that you know that your jurisdiction is paying for and not really getting compensated for, which would then inflame the identity question there. And I guess a kind of related thing, I was trying to think about the future using digital. Is the only place to do, you kept on saying the word border checks. Well, when I think of some of the work that Emmanuel's doing, where's the border and where's the checking? Checking's usually not done at the border anymore. We've got all this AI, facial recognition software, so that's tracking, right? So that's the function of the border is to track for security purposes, I guess. So is there any thinking that's going on about getting different kinds of tracking mechanisms that kind of substitutes for the border checking process?
Yeah, I think that's definitely the way that they have to tackle this problem. But you have also, this is also again a question you have to agree on doing this together. The Schengen information system was actually the basis for this. But it's not going far enough because all these, if you do this with all the technology, then you have to also agree on giving out a lot of national high security information, and I think there are a lot of EU member states still very hesitant to do so. But I think sometimes you can think of also using technology to have, for example, if you think of the classical border controller is really the person who's, that happened in France at the border between Strasbourg and Kiev, the border control, in the classical sense. But you could think of a method for example, okay, you need a border check, but there are some people which might still be able to cross, for example, cross-border workers. And then you could imagine systems like, for example, I don't know, some sort of plaquette on the car which identifies you as a cross-border worker, and then you could drive on one line, or some kind of. This could be, or maybe if that already exists. I mean,
Yeah,
this.
we have this here.
Yeah, and that's something that unfortunately the Europeans have not so much thought about, and I said at lunchtime already. It's because nobody has ever thought of associating the local and regional authorities to find solutions for the specific territories they're dealing with. For the moment it's a national issue, but it's not national because the borders are territorialized, and it's at the border where you have to deal with things. So you could say the Alsace and the Baden-Württemberg put into place this plaquette for those who cross every day, and that would not solve the whole problem, but it would facilitate the flows in that sense.
I mean, you just think right now in the UK, you can't go anywhere without being on CCTV. I mean, it's just, everything's monitored, and it's done at the local level. The information flows to whatever authority, police or national. I don't know what the rest of Europe looks like, and I realize that's sensitive for both, not necessarily national police forces, but just police forces and intelligence agencies. But have any of you read Neil Stephenson's stuff, The Diamond Age and Snow Crash and all that, where actually the state provides less security, and it's really in the world of nanotechnology that it's more granular, and therefore the role of a nation state in providing access to employment opportunities but also security is removed. And the question is, what is the right level of analysis, level to provide that?
So one comment on this. Cities like Marseille, for instance, have CCTV inside. And when we organized the summer schools there, we had actually a group of students. We had 5 group work on different topics. One of them was on mapping out the CCTV, and they were able to do it. What they also found out is that one of the problems is the loopholes in the CCTV system, and that a lot of petty criminals inside the city of Marseille are totally aware of it. They know exactly how to disappear, the ins and the outs. And the other thing is, how well is that connected to the national level infrastructures or the European ones? Because you have, this is municipal force level of CCTV, so they actually use this to protect certain areas of the city. Just to illustrate this, the city of Marseille, you probably know, is one of the poorest per capita in France, but it has also among the wealthiest neighborhoods of France, as wealthy as Paris, which are basically on the seaside. And so you have areas of CCTV that covers all of the fancy neighborhoods, right? And inside, like at the core from a spatial perspective, it's like you have pieces of the puzzle that are missing. So you can walk in the middle of the fancy neighborhoods outside of the CCTV system, or you can cross them and go from a place where you have disappeared to appear and redisappear and reappear. Sometimes the same streets, right? Because they have really mapped out certain streets, certain neighborhoods out. And so because it's incomplete, it has all these problems. So you have the level that you were talking about is the connection with, for instance, national level police force and the basically treatment of the data, and the fact that it's also done in the patchwork way at the local level. Just as a joke, our students were mapping out regular collection of garbage and found some areas where it was almost the same. So you had cleaner streets where you had CCTV, and dirtier streets where you didn't. But that's the city of Marseille. So that's, the kind of problems that.
I have a question. I want you to elaborate a little bit more on the externalization of the border, because this came up this morning too, and I think that there's some real like ethical and human rights issues that come up. And you said that they're externalizing the border because it's not working.
Yep.
And mean, I think we're developing more and more policies, as Everett said, the border's out there, it's functioning out there. But what does that mean in terms of kind of, for an asylum system that's supposed to be built around protection and rights and access to a system, and yet the use of externalization policies that the premise is deterrence and security?
I can't really answer this question because this is just what's happening. If you look at the political development, this is what it's because I think it's not only because they don't deal with they can't find a compromise, but they don't actually know how to deal also with all this problem. And so they have to find, I mean, the Turkey-EU deal, I mean, has been pushed forward also by Angela Merkel, because for her it was the solution to the non-agreement on the quotas for Dublin. This is how she was able to but because now we have no longer any asylum seekers or many coming into Germany. It's a temporary solution which puts a big question mark on the human rights issue, because outside the territory of the European Union you don't have the same rules for the human rights protection. And that really it's an ethical problem, but nobody talks about it, because for the moment it's the only solution that they can find. It's for me it's not a long-term solution. It's a temporary one, but which is
and yet we don't know what the long-term consequences of it will be, and whether it's going to be.
Well, the consequences are already there for the EU deal. I mean, the Turkey has fortified its bargaining position towards the EU enormously with this. Because they knew exactly that the EU was dependent on that agreement. So you have already short-term consequences of the externalization. But I mean, if you want to tackle the problem, you also have to look more into, we didn't touch about this at all, but you have to also look at development policies, because you have to, and that was a lot of things that was said by the sociologists also in Strasbourg, to say that, well, you have to tackle the problem at the origin, because not everybody, when it's Syrians, okay, there is a war, but there are other migrants coming in for economic reasons, and if you want them to stay in their country, then you have to, you don't have to put into place Frontex, but you better put into place good development policies which enable them to stay there. So in the long-term perspective, that's what I think you have to do.
I'm curious about judicial review of asylum decisions done by nation states.
Mm-hmm.
Is the judicial oversight excuse me, exclusively the responsibility of individual parties, or is there any role for a European court to review an individual migration decision?
Oh wow! Because I'm not a legal expert, I'm not sure. I know that the human rights issues, if somebody, and there has been a lot of case, you can better answer this question than I can, they can go before the court in Strasbourg, which is not the European Union, but the Court of Human Rights, so they can address, if they think that they have been not well treated by one of the member states of the European Union regarding their human rights issue, they can go before the court of in Strasbourg. Otherwise, if the Dublin regulation is violated, no citizen can address the European Court directly. It has to be a member state against another member state. That is dealt with on the level of the European Court of Justice. So that's interstate affairs, the European justice. And the migrant who thinks that he has not, or the asylum seeker who is not being dealt with properly, can go before the jurisdiction of the member states where they are, where they are refused, for example. They can go through the procedure there. But then the expulsion decision is also one of them on national level and not on the EU level. So I talk a little bit under your control. These are very legal questions. I've looked into them, but I'm not. I don't know all the refining legal questions.
I would like to come back to the question how this migration crisis was caused. You were saying something like Angela Merkel has caused the peak of the migration crisis out of humanitarian sentiment.
Maybe not only.
Yeah, because at that time these refugees were already there. They were not in Germany, but they were in Hungary. And as far as I know, Merkel also considered the problems of destabilization of the Balkan countries, which was quite difficult situation at that time. And the other point I would like to make is, apart from the development policies, I mean, I think that is really important. Border control, you cannot control borders completely, that is absolutely out of question, but to control migration would mean not only to have a better development policies, but also to understand that the EU, by subsidizing, for example, agricultural products and sending them to Africa, they produce migration back to Europe, which I think is a big problem. And the second problem, as far as I remember, was the Syrians. They didn't come to Germany because they thought Germany would be great, but because the camps around Syria, in Jordan and in Lebanon, they didn't receive enough money from the UN member states, and that caused people to leave. So I think, of course, there are many problems with the EU-Turkey treaty, but the idea that the EU funds camps in the neighbor states of Syria or other war-ridden countries, I think that is a very good idea.
The only question is that how to secure also the maintaining of the human rights or the standards there.
The human rights standards on the Greek islands are not very high as well.
No. Yeah, okay, it's a good argument. On Angela Merkel, I've really simplified the motive of Angela. Nobody really knows her motive. I mean, she has been largely criticized by her own party for this, as you know. But a lot of analysts also say that it was for economic reasons, because Germany needs the labor force in the long run, so that could also have been a motivation. I'm not so sure. I think what you just mentioned, definitely, I mean, there are several aspects of the decision, and she did not cause the migration crisis. What she caused was the problem of the Dublin Convention in the European Union, because she caused the suspension of that agreement, and she was partially responsible for that, because maybe it would have broken down anyway. I don't know, but it definitely accelerated the breaking down of Dublin at that point.
Just to go on this issue, the Dublin Agreement just meant, together with some national law, that Germany didn't accept any asylum seeker, only if they flew in. This was the only way to come to Germany, flew in directly from somewhere, which is not possible without a visa. So that meant in Italy and in Greece there are so many refugees or migrants, and Germany didn't accept any refugee, which was quite unjust. So I think the crisis didn't start in 2015, but in 2010 they should have...
or even before, because the Germans had not a very welcoming migration policy. I remember one presentation in Strasbourg on this issue, so they have been advocated as those who've been the most welcoming, but in fact before they weren't. It's true. Yeah.
In a way, studying migration policy, I think Dublin and Schengen are really interesting case studies from non-Europeans to understand how complex the European system is. I mean, the more I study them, the more I think it's really neat, because you have European level laws, you have national level laws as well, and then you've got also local ones. And the way the European system works is that it actually takes sometimes just one part of one area of one policy and Europeanizes this with hope that eventually it can become so-called a common policy, right? So the main difference between the intergovernmental system and the common system is the way you vote about policy. So when the ministers meet in Brussels, they can decide at majority plus one, or they can decide at unanimity, and there are some areas where actually it's in between. It's between majority plus one and unanimity. So the intergovernmental system, for instance, today basically rules the game of who takes basically the migrants, and that's why they can agree, right? Because one says no and
Yeah.
nothing is done.
Yeah.
And on Schengen, however, which is an interesting area, Frontex, for instance, is under EU legislation. So Frontex is this agency that has gotten since 2015 a literally an expansion of its budget, but also its staffing. The budget, I think, was multiplied by 4, but it's under EU legislation only. And originally it's an intelligence agency, but now it's starting to have both arms and legs because it has staff that has multiplied by 2, so in 2016, and now they're creating a EU border force, which is a separate agency, but it's related to Frontex. And so you can see that in these areas, the EU is very good at actually moving forward. But when we look at it from outside, we see all of these very important aspects, human rights aspects, security aspects, right, that are not addressed because they're outside of the EU.
Yeah.
They are still with the states, or part of certain states' agreements are intergovernmental, where the states, and that's one of the things that we discussed this morning, right, which I think is really interesting, is that there is no equity of welcome, even though you have EU regulation, on the way you should, and what the Parliament identified as early, I think that's, what is the data that I have on some of my work? Anyways, 2004, that if you walked into the EU in 2004 in Spain, or let's say you walk into the EU in Sweden or in France, if you can actually do that, right? You never know. Well, the level, the standards are very different. So you may be much better welcome in the wealthier country. That's why they use GDP. Who talked about GDP? That's one of the factors this morning. One of the students who raised the issue. You raised the issue of GDP. Because that's what the Parliament had identified. But I think, maybe it's better to actually be welcome in Spain, because it's also a country that does this fairly well and has a lot of experience in this regard. Anyway, so I'm just talking about this from the perspective of studying the EU, not just the perspective of the ethics and the human rights issues and all of this. I think for policymakers, it becomes really important for us to actually highlight these differences, because otherwise we bundle them into one and we think, the system is like in the US or the system is like in Canada, they can't make any decisions. Actually, the systems, like the context of the policy making is very different, and we don't understand it very well. So.
It also makes a difference too, as you were pointing out, and I think you were, what kind of migrant you are coming in. So if you come in by an airport, you're treated differently than if you come in by train, and or if you cross the border, walk-in, depending on which part. So it's sort of like you have overlapping systems that, in Australia, they're just like Germany. They welcome people coming in by plane, but not by boat. They're going to put you on an island somewhere. I have one, this is off-the-wall kind of question. It's more wondering by way of explanation. So you're talking about national identity, different reactions to this crisis, but also some of these other things that we're talking about. I was just wondering, I want to make a distinction, I don't know the real language here, between internal movement over the last 40 years, right? With this kind of really idealized view of moving all 4 categories of people, goods, services, and capital versus this external migration challenge. And I'm sure there must be literature on this. To what extent has the internal movement of people across Europe changed attitudes in the identity question? So, for example, if you're from a country, I don't know what is the case, say, in Poland or Hungary, where the walls come down, all your universities in the rest of Europe, and you only leave people who are sort of working class, rural, tied to the land. They're going to have a very different view about what, first of all, internal movement's all about, but also what external migration looks like. And I'm just wondering if that mental map of what Europe used to be like when it came to these questions decades ago versus now looks like. There's a residual attitudes now that have.
Yeah, I mean, you can see that in the votes of the extremist right-wing parties. They're mostly, you find the most votes in little villages where the people never move, where they've never ever seen a migrant, and so that's where you have the anti-migrant
That's
votes.
in Canada and the U.S. too, right?
And if that's a human accident. Not, I mean, the mobility in Europe. That's a good point that you just mentioned. Is it's a little bit also. False image in Europe without borders. Not everybody is moving, and not only in Hungary, everywhere. You know, not, those who are mobile are the educated, the privileged, the rich people. They can move across, and they profit from the Europe without borders. And those who are not educated, or they will not go. And so this is something that the European Union knows, and they are trying to develop programs in Erasmus for this type of public in order to make them move more, because once you move across Europe you become more open, and you're also more open to questions of external, migration. So they try and tackle this, but it's very difficult because they don't find a lot of people willing to move when they haven't got a certain. It's also a question of language, because in Europe you have so many different languages. So if you don't talk Swedish, it's difficult to convince somebody who's, I don't know, doing a baker to spend a year in Sweden.
I have a similar question to that one. Is there any sense that the destinations of choice for the Europeans that do move internally and migrants coming from the outside are the same? Is everybody fighting for the same city to live in, or are they going to different?
No, it's very different. Apparently, it's very different. It depends also on language skills, but also sometimes on relatives that some of them might have. For example, that's a big issue to go to the United Kingdom, apparently. I don't think that so many studies have been done on it, but it's very diverse. It's not. There's no logic. It's the logic. I'll go there where I get most of the benefit is one element, but that's not necessarily a determinative one.
You know, the Brexit in this regard is really interesting. We're Anglophone, it's easy to actually tap and to look into this. And I think it's interesting because of the large numbers. So you have large numbers of Europeans in the UK. Millions. And you have large numbers of British investors, for instance, in Spain, in Portugal, in south of France, in Croatia. But they are the socioeconomic status people that Birte just talked about, right? If you move into Spain, you're moving with €500,000. So these status that have provided you with the right to work, to invest, but also access to all kind of regulatory system like healthcare. People have benefited from this, right? And I would say, interestingly, in the UK, it's not. The UK has attracted different kinds of. I was looking at this for the Brexit issue. Has attracted different kind of individuals, but for instance, people talk in the UK about. You Polish plumber. Right? So these are people who have the right to move, but when the four freedoms, that's your question, Everett, when the four freedom came in force, the understanding was more ambitious than the practice is today, because today European nationals, nationals from the European member states can move and stay in countries as long as they can demonstrate economic independence through work or investment. So your Polish plumber can stay in the UK as long as your Polish plumber has work. And your retiree can stay in Spain as long as they can afford to stay in Spain. But that's a restrictive interpretation from the European Court of Justice. Frédéric, by the way, He's the one who pointed this out and wrote a paper on this. Which
What's
I
really
think was
interesting, again, to the non-specialist here is, there, as you call it, the European project, right? And really, what this is all pointing out is there's a limit to the narrative, right? So, and whose idea was the European project? Was it your laborer who had a single language from Eastern Hungary? No, it was an investor in Budapest who wanted to be able to move and start businesses around, right? So there's this, so I'm wondering, like, who are the holders of the narrative? Well, we're saying young people, investors, people probably of certain classes, maybe different family linkage, lifestyle groups. And then there's this kind of other crowd, and the reality of a system that still functions on a national basis and often very local basis. And so it's this whole round of stress has really pointed to the narrative. And when you think about the four freedoms, I mean, that is a totally, I mean, you think about neoclassical economics, right? That's neoclassical economics. Saying that, and that you put your, like I'm a great fan of the European project. I'm not against it, but I'm just saying that it's a fantastic idea.
Delors was a social democrat, but he was also a banker, right? He was formerly from the French central bank. Right? So we have to close. It's the end of the time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.